Has this market bottomed?
Morning, David. Hopefully, we are approaching the bottom if it's not already bottomed, and therefore we become more optimistic, let's say, and constructive on China equities, and we overweight on China equities based on valuation call.
Okay. What do you think is making things maybe the bullish case to be emerging? Is it the most fundamental factor is the fact that China seems to be sort of framing some extra strategy when it comes to COVID? Is it the policy support? And is it enough to actually offset some of the earnings that we've seen?
Let's say, actually, the earnings from corporates announced so far have been more resilient than what's expected. And of course, the policy support definitely helps. And the intention of the authorities to support the slowing economic growth is definitely helping. Well, I boil it down to the bottom line. I think what's more important is how effective the control is on the Omicron outbreak among quite a number of cities in China. So in other words, if the Omicron outbreak becomes more under control, we would be coming out of the woods pretty soon. And let's hope that the controls are more effective than not, like what we've seen 2 years ago.
Okay, so in the meantime, you say don't be too pessimistic, but you're still leaning towards defensive sectors. What do you anticipate, Selina, to be shifting toward once sentiment does improve?
Once the sentiment improves, I believe that some of the retail-oriented or retail-related sectors and companies will see quite a sharp bounce in share price performance. But in the meanwhile, while we are still being negatively affected by Omicron, overweighting those sectors would be a little bit too risky. And therefore, we try to be more defensive when things are quite uncertain at this point.
You've said before to, in terms of the property space, to trade some of these majors. Given the LPR that we saw on Friday, is it time to kind of add more risk to that sector and maybe broaden that scope a little bit more?
Yes, definitely. What we believe is that when the authorities is trying to support the economy, one of the sectors that cannot be avoided from being supported would be the real estate sector. And when the loan prime rate long-term, so 5-year, are being cut, that directly supports the mortgage or would be positive to the mortgage for housing. And therefore, when the housing market or property market is being supported, that would benefit the economic growth. And I believe that there will be further room for support to come through to that sector. So it makes sense to broaden the exposure to the real estate sector, especially the state-owned entities.
Selina, we're showing the Hang Seng Index 20,500. Your target is 22,000 the end of this year. That barely doesn't even get us back to the start of April. Talk to us about the 22,000 target.
Well, let's carry this out one thing at a step. So one step every time. So we try to be more constructive first before going overall very aggressively on all the sectors, especially when things are quite uncertain under the Omicron outbreak. So we try to be more defensive. But valuation-wise, the market as a whole is looking very attractive.
We have big earnings coming out in tech. Yeah. Alibaba, Baidu, NetEase this week. Do you think the 10 cents, what we heard last week, the gloomy guidance and the earnings, is that going to be a bellwether of what's to come?
I think it's pretty much expected by the market when we are talking about companies that would rely on advertisement for revenue. When we are talking about companies that rely on retail activities for revenue, those would definitely be negatively affected due to the mobility restriction. So a lot of the negative news are already reflected in the price, is what I would say. And hopefully, when the results come through, we would hear a little bit more about the guidance or what the management's targeting over the short run and the medium run.
Selina, back to your earlier point, since we're talking earnings here, things have been resilient. It's worth noting that the numbers we have are for the first quarter. I'm looking at a 20% projected CSI 300 as far as earnings expectations are concerned this year, forecast at least. Do you think 20%, is that just right, or is that too optimistic?
I believe it really depends on how effective the Omicron outbreak control would become. If the outbreak lasts a little bit longer meaning beyond early June or mid-June, probably that earnings growth would have a little bit more risks on the downside. But if the outbreak becomes very much under control sooner than early June, then that number would be realistic.